I'm back. Sorry for the lack of uploads. I have been busy. Playing Elden Ring, and I have also been following the situation in Ukraine. I've been getting a lot of comments from people asking me for my take on the situation, on what is happening with the Russian tanks and so on. But instead of pretending to know what is going on, and talking some nonsense, I will refrain myself from talking about it until it is over, which may take some time, but it is what it is. I know my content mainly revolves around Russian and Ukrainian armored vehicles, and it will continue to do so, because that is, again, what my channel mainly revolves around. And for this video, I have thought, instead of rambling about things, I could do something useful and show you all how to recognize the tanks that are involved in the conflict. First, we take a look at how to quickly tell apart between T-72, T-64 and T-80 tanks. The main thing people usually look at are the wheels. The T-64 features a flat-face road wheel which is smaller than both T-72 and T-80 wheels. The wheel is reinforced with 10 divots that go around the center, which features a cover held on by small bolts. And unlike T-72 and T-80, the idler wheel is identical to the road wheels on the T-64 in both size and shape. The T-80 features a larger wheel than T-64, which consists of two major parts which are bolted together with large bolts surrounding a center protruding cylinder. Unlike T-64, which has rubber on the inside, T-80 wheels have a large rubber band around the wheel. The idler wheel is smaller than the road wheels and features a spoked construction, similar to what you might see on cars or bikes. T-72 wheels are also large, but are different from T-80 wheels. They also have bolts around the center, but the bolts are bolted into the indentations on the wheels. There are 10 indentations, one for each bolt. The indentations are very easy to notice, and that is probably the easiest way to tell them apart from T-80 wheels. The T-72 idler wheel is also smaller than the road wheels, but features 5 holes around the center. It should be noted that T-90 tanks also share the wheels with the T-72. From the rear, it is also easy to tell them apart. T-64 tanks have a long heat exhaust, long and slim, while T-80 tanks have a bit chunkier one, which is shorter but also comes down a slope. T-72 tanks don't have such things on the back, and neither do T-90 tanks. Another way to tell them apart is the turret rear. T-64 tanks have a long fording tube put on the very back of the storage box, which is sloped upwards. The fording tube also has a curve at one end, which is often also seen from the front. T-80 tanks have really big fording tubes on the back and have no curves on them. They have a weirdly shaped part attached to the fording tube and the radiator cover also at the back of the turret. But if the fording tube is really big, then it's a T-80 tank. The fording tube on T-72 is attached to the back of the tank on the back of the storage box, but unlike the T-64 one, this tube is short and small. The case is the same on the T-90, and because of its size, you can't really see it from the front. Now we come to more specific things. One way you can tell T-72 from T-64, T-80 and T-90 is by the fact that T-72 has a heavy machine gun on the turret pointing away from the commander's sight. You can tell which way the commander's sight is pointing by the infrared searchlight which is right above it. And the commander's hatch also opens away from the heavy machine gun. An exception to this rule is the Ukrainian T-72A and T, which received the remotely operated HMG of the T-64 tanks. One way to recognize the T-80 tanks from the rest is by the driver's periscopes. T-80 has 3 periscopes on the hull's front, while T-72, T-64 and T-90 tanks have a single, larger periscope in the center. If there is an infrared searchlight present, you can recognize the T-64s by the fact that they have the searchlight to the left side of the gun, while T-80 and T-72 have it placed on the right side of the gun. One exception from this would be some T-64BM tanks, which have been seen sometimes with an infrared searchlight placed on top of ERA to the right side of the gun, which is unique for those tanks since no other tank has infrared searchlight placed over ERA. Now that we got that out of the way, we will take a look at specific variants of each model. There are 4 different variants of T-64 that you can come across: T-64BV, T-64BV Model 2017, T-64BM and T-64BM2. There are 6 different T-72 tanks: T-72A, T-72AV, T-72B, T-72B Model 1989, T-72B3, and T-72B3M. and 7 if we included the Ukrainian T-72A and T. And there are 5 different T-80 tank variants: T-80BV, T-80BV 2017, T-80U, T-80UK, and T-80BVM. And of course, there is a T-90A tank. T-64BV is the original variant of the already mentioned variants, but of course it wasn't the first T-64 tank, but it is the most common one. The tank has no thermal sights and thus has an infrared searchlight placed on the left side of the main gun. The T-64BV model 2017 is very similar to the T-64BV, but omits the searchlight since it has a thermal sight, and has additional ERA blocks where the searchlight used to be. It also has a small antenna on the back of the turret for GPS. This is also the case with the difference between T-80BV and T-80BV 2017. Now, I have seen T-64BV being mistaken for T-72AV and T-80BV tanks, and vice versa, so I will give you some tips on how you can tell them apart. Now, they are usually mistaken because they all have contact 1 ERA and have a V-shaped placement on the turret. In comparison, T-72B has the ERA placed flat on the turret's front. Of course, we talked about the wheels, the fording tubes, etc. Those will be your main way to tell them apart. Now, if you don't see any of that, it could be hard. I have also seen a T-80BV tank with blown up wheels, which made them look smaller, and people mistook it for T-64BV tank. Now, T-80BV tanks have 4 ERA blocks on the sides of the turret placed on spacers. That is because the smoke launchers are taking up room on the turret's side. T-64BV usually also has ERA placed on the sides of the turret, but it is placed directly on the turret with no spacers, and usually behind the smoke launchers. T-64BV, unlike T-72AV and T-80BV, has 2 rows of contact 1 ERA on the upper front of the turret. T-80BV also has only 1 row of ERA on the sides of the hull. T-72AV can be told apart by the fact that, unlike T-64BV and T-80BV, it does not have an ATGM guidance system, which is located on the right side of the turret in front of the commander's cupola on T-64BV and T-80BV. And by the fact that the HMG is always facing away from the commander's side. And of course, don't forget the wheels, periscopes, and fording tubes. Now, as I mentioned, the T-72B, which is also similar to those tanks, has ERA placed flat on the turret, so that is the easiest way to tell it apart from the other tanks, especially the T-72AV, because they will have the same wheels and other stuff. Now, other similar looking tanks are T-80U and T-64BM tanks, because of their rubber shields hanging from the turret ERA and over the lower front plate. The best way to tell them apart are the searchlights. If there is no searchlight and ERA is in its place, then it's definitely a T-64BM2 tank, considering that it is in the Ukrainian conflict, since there are some T-80U tanks which have thermal integrated in the main gun sight, but those are extremely rare and have not been deployed. But again, if there is a searchlight, then the left of the gun is T-64, right of the gun is T-80U. Another way to tell them apart is the heavy machine gun. You see, T-80U tanks do not have remotely operated HMGs. In fact, it is not even placed on top of the commander's cupola. T-80BV tanks also don't have remotely operated HMGs, but they are placed on top of the cupola in the similar fashion to the T-64's remote HMG. Instead, T-80U tanks have 3 mounts around the cupola, 1 right of it, 1 left of it, and 1 to the back. The HMG can be placed on either of those, depending on the preference. Most often you will see them placed on the one right of the cupola. The ERA placement is also different from other tanks with heavy ERA. T-80U tanks have visible spacers between ERA panels on the hull, which is not seen on any other tank. Now, there are some special variants that have been deployed. The T-80UK is the most notable one. It has, or should I say, had, because Russians managed to lose it,
betrayed, forgot, abandoned.
Shtora dazzlers on the front of the turret, as well as laser warning receivers and meteorological sensor on the back of the turret. This is not present on any other T-80U tank that has been deployed. Another T-80U that was seen was the one with PLISSA thermal mounted instead of the IR searchlight. For some reason, some have mistaken it for T-80UD tank, but we will get to that later. All you have to know is that it is a T-80U tank. Another tank that can look similar to those two is the T-72A and T, because of its rubber shields. But it is not hard to tell it apart. First, of course, the wheels and other stuff, but it also has small contact 1 blocks with an orange filler placed on the hull. Now, there are Russian T-72B3 tanks, probably the most famous ones. Still, people have mistaken them for T-90 tanks. There are regular T-72B3 and T-72B3M tanks that have been deployed. These tanks can be easily recognized by their front contact 5 ERA placement, because of its gaps, since no other tank has big ERA blocks with gaps placed on the turret. You can tell a regular T-72B3 from B3M by several different things. T-72B3 has contact 5 ERA on the sides, which are only 3 square panels on each side. T-72B3M in comparison has relic side skirts which cover most of the tank's side. T-72B3M also has ERA blocks placed on the turret's side, instead of the storage boxes which can be seen on T-72B3. T-72B3M has a small ERA block placed left of the main gun, something which is not present on the regular T-72B3 tanks. Now, I have seen T-72B3 tanks which only have relic side skirts, but have storage boxes on the turret side instead of ERA, and also like the ERA block on the turret's front. I'm not sure those are really T-72B3M tanks, but I would rather say those are regular T-72B3 tanks with mounted relic side skirts for extra protection, but don't quote me on that. Now, T-72B model 1989 can very often be mistaken for T-72B3 tank, because it also has contact 5 ERA. Now, it is not hard to tell them apart. T-72B model 1989 has an infrared searchlight on the turret's front, right of the main gun, and also does not have the big Sosna U sight, but a small night vision sight which can also be seen on T-72B tanks. It also lacks a meteorological sensor which can be seen on T-72B3. Now, we have the T-80BVM. This tank can only be mistaken for T-72B3M perhaps, because of the relic side skirts. But if I see the side skirts, the first thing I look at is if there are holes in the rubber hanging down. T-80BVM has square holes in the rubber, probably to allow for easier climbing onto the tank, while T-72B3M lacks those. Now, another very easy way to tell them apart is the fact that T-80BVM has relic ERA, which is bigger and it has no gaps in its placement. And of course, always look at the wheels, boarding tubes and other stuff. I have to keep reminding you of that because those are the easiest ways to tell those tanks apart. In this instance, the heavy machine gun is also another very easy way to tell. Now, there are specific tanks such as T-72A and T-90A. T-72A is the only one that has smoke launchers on the front of the turret. Even though they have been seen with some ERA placed on them, especially on the side, they will still not have them placed on the turret's front. Keep in mind though that there are a couple of T-64B tanks that have ERA placed on them. Those are also old tanks that don't have ERA by default. I have seen one of those as well, so if you see smoke launchers on the turret front, look out for other indications such as wheels, heavy machine gun, fording tube, etc. to be sure it is a T-72A or T-64B. Who knows, we might even see a T-80B tank like that. And T-90A is probably the easiest one to tell apart in my opinion, simply because it has the Stora dazzlers on the turret's front and a welded turret. Of course, from a distance, it could have been mistaken for the T-80UK, but since Russians managed to lose the only one they sent, well, if you see Stora dazzlers, it is probably a T-90A tank. From the side, if it has sharp angles of the turret, that means it is welded, which is kinda unique for a T-90A. It also has the contact 5 panels on the side, which are the 3 square panels on each side, as well as a remotely operated heavy machine gun, which is pointing the same way as the commander's sight. So it is really hard to mistake it for a T-72B3. Now, I have seen people call some T-80U tanks T-80UD. T-80UD tanks have been, to my knowledge, replaced in the Ukrainian active service, and Russia does not operate those, because the diesel engines that have been used for them have only been made in Ukraine during USSR, and as such, Russia scrapped them and used their turrets to make T-80UE1 tanks, which have so far not been deployed. During the production of this video, I was made aware that at least one T-80UE1 has been deployed. As I mentioned, they have T-80UD turrets, but they also have thermal integrated into the main gun sight. Because of that, you can tell them apart from the other T-80Us by the remotely operated heavy machine gun and the lack of an infrared searchlight and the extra ERA block in its stead. But if some T-80UD does pop out, you can tell it apart by the fact that it has a remotely operated heavy machine gun, meaning it is on the commander's cupola, unlike regular T-80U tanks. It has a T-64 style fording tube, along with a curve at the end. Ukraine should operate the T-84 tanks, but so far I haven't really seen any pictures or videos of them. But they can look very similar to the T-90A, because they also have welded turrets and dazzlers on the front. But they have smaller ERA blocks, often with the rubber shields, and also have 3 periscopes for the driver in the T-80 style, as well as T-80 style wheels. Now for the end, I will prepare a written guide with pictures on how to recognize those tanks, which I will also update if necessary. I will leave a link to it in the description and the pinned comment. That will be all. If you like my content, you can consider supporting me on Patreon and get access to my Discord server. You can also leave a like or subscribe to the channel if you're new. That also helps a lot. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a nice day.